Welcome to TheoLIVE episode, I think this is episode 11. It's kind of crazy. I've been doing this for about 2.5 months now. Is that how math works? I don't know. That's not what my show's about. My show's about theology. We're not about math. Math doesn't matter here unless we're talking about like the Trinity. 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, and it also equals 1. Let's see who's hopping in here. We got Mike saying good afternoon. It's afternoon where he is. I guess technically it is where I am now. It's time change wrecks us. Like, we don't change here. I talked about this in the last show. We don't change, which is super helpful, but everybody else changes. And I'm like, what time is it? Like Siri, like the main thing I use Siri for is just to tell me like what time it is in New York or in Seattle. That's basically it. John coming in here. I was trying to figure out why my computer was making sound. Turns out I jumped in here and minimized the window. That'll happen to you. I don't know if you heard, but I also had like 2 versions of the sound going because I forgot to mute the iPad. Needs more cowbell in the song. Granted, I think every song is pretty much like that, right? You needs more cowbell. That's the best I got. Christopher Walken. It's not the best impression. I'm just going to be honest, but you're not here for impressions. We're here about theology, and we'll get to theology in a couple minutes here. I might be stepping in it today. I don't know. I feel like the internet is just like burning down. talking about this thing, deconstruction, exvangelicals, all that kind of stuff. So we'll be diving somewhat deep into it. I'd be interested if you guys are here right now. If you're watching, if you're watching, thank you. Thank you for coming. If you are new to the channel, maybe this is one of the first videos that you've seen, think about subscribing. We do live shows. I do live shows every Monday. And then later on in the week, I try to do at least one more video about theology. If that's interesting to you, think about subscribing. And if you're here watching right now, definitely go ahead and go right up there and click that like button. Mostly so I feel better about myself. That's basically what it is. I don't know. People say, oh, well, that means that YouTube will send it out to more people. I don't know if that's true or not. I just like it and it feels good. So help me out and hit that like button. Talking about like things going on with YouTube. Look at this. This is pretty cool. 482. We are 18 away from 500, the big 500. That's really exciting. Honestly, I'm a little surprised because about, when was it? It was back in like June. I think I cracked 100. And so, I mean, it's been building for a little bit, and I appreciate that. And that Mark Driscoll video really helped with that. But why do I talk about this? Well, because I'm going to have some fun with it. If I get to 500 by, let's say, next week, I'm thinking about doing a live stream where I talk about my setup, give you a little bit behind the scenes. I've figured out how to rig my iPhone into this thing and kind of show around. And I would like to talk about what goes on behind the scenes with doing a YouTube channel. And specifically, like what gear I use. It's kind of interesting. If you're interested in YouTube, I think it would be interesting to talk about, the gear that I use, specifically how I do things for cheap. That's the main thing. Like when you try to do this thing and try to have a live show and you try to make it look at least decent, and I hope that it looks at least decent to you, it can cost a lot of money. And thankfully, I've figured out some ways to kind of cut corners here and there to make it look, I think, decent, and also not like have my wife be really mad at me for all the money that I've spent on YouTube. And some people have that. Some people have it and they could spend as much as they want and buy the fanciest gear and, just look like, all like tech everywhere. And that's cool if you got the budget for it. I don't. So I've done it on the cheap. It's rigged up. I think you guys would be interested to see like what this actually looks like apart from this little square that you see. But yeah, if I hit 500, maybe this week or next week, I'll do a live show and kind of give you a little bit behind the scenes. And if you're thinking, well, Dean, you sound excited about it, so maybe you'll just do it anyways. I probably will. But 500 would be cool too at the same time. Why does it matter? I don't know, because it does. It's fun. It's fun to have more subscribers and more people hopping into the chat and talking about these things together. Last week was a lot of fun. I just want to touch on a few things from last week before we get into the topic at hand. Last week, me and my wife had a fun time chatting about our background with fundamentalism and leaving fundamentalism. And it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I think Heather really enjoyed it, and we might make that a thing every once in a while, which is pretty exciting because I've been trying real hard to like get her in and try to, do a show together. I thought about a podcast, his and her theology. It would be interesting because she cares about theology, and so I don't know. Maybe that's gotten her thinking a little bit more about it. But we might do that every so often. But I did want to clean up a few things because this is TheoLIVE and I like to talk about theology. And I feel like we talked a lot more about personal things and relationship, which was great. And I think super helpful, especially when it comes to talking about leaving a denomination, because that is a really emotional decision. and has emotional effects, lots of emotional effects after the fact. But I did want to talk just for a minute about some more of the theology behind it. Specifically, this idea of separation when it comes to fundamentalists. One of their main aspects of their theology is the idea of separation. And I kind of talked about it a little bit last episode. But when it becomes such a definitive part of your theology where you're always talking about separation, it becomes an us versus them mentality when it comes to the rest of Christendom. And I talked a little bit about how I didn't like the idea that, my church couldn't cooperate with that church, couldn't do things with that church, and how it kind of made this bubble. But I would also say that also impacts relationships within the church. When that's such a definitive part of your theology, this idea of separation, and you always have that in your mind of whether someone's going down the wrong path, or they're on a bad trajectory. That's often the phrase that is used. That actually affects how you interact within the church. And so bubbles form within these kinds of groups. Actually, kind of interesting. A couple episodes I talked about the Church of God Restoration and Henry Hildebrandt and all those guys. And if you haven't watched that episode, please go and watch it. I think it's really helpful. And in fact, a few people who had left that cult started talking to me in messages, and now on YouTube they found it and found it very helpful. And some of the stories I'm hearing from them seems actually pretty familiar with that idea of separation, when you kind of set yourself aside and say that we are the right ones. Well, that makes little bubbles within these groups, and then you have hierarchical ideas about the leadership and authoritarianism. I think it really boils down to that idea of separation. So my point in saying this is, if you're a Baptist, or I guess you could be really from any denomination, but you really have this main focus on separation, or at least it's a pretty big deal when it comes to your theology and how you operate as a church, I think that you need to be careful, because that kind of thinking, I'm not saying there aren't times to separate from people. If they start affirming all kinds of different things that the Bible doesn't, then of course, there's something that needs to be done there. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't separate in that instance. But when you do that, you kind of bring in a lot of these thoughts inside your church, and you'll find that there's probably a lot of cliques, a lot of bubbles that are forming, and not actual fellowship and relationship that we see in the New Testament happening within your church. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, because I think it was kind of clear, but I wanted to make sure that the relationship stuff is really coming out of theology. It's not just, how people act. There are reasons why people act a certain way. And today we're going to be talking about some more reasons why people act a certain way. So I had made a video back in April, I think, about deconstruction. This was after Paul Maxwell. He's a Reformed guy, respected by a lot of people who are in my camp. I never really read the guy. I know he had, I think, a pretty popular podcast, but he left the faith, and I think I have him and Joshua Harris kind of mixed into my brain about what exactly happened when they left the faith. But they deconstructed. And so a lot of people were talking about it back in April, and it's been a thing for the last couple of years. Rhett and Link, big YouTube guys that I used to watch a lot, actually, especially when I was a youth pastor. You can get a lot of great ideas from watching Rhett and Link. But I really respected those guys, what they were trying to do on YouTube, have this family-friendly kind of show. And now it's not so family friendly. Interesting how that happens. But they did a couple podcasts on their show, Ear Biscuits, talking about their deconstruction stories, and that kind of fed into all of this. So the last, I think, probably 2 years or so, there have been so many people who have deconstructed their faith, and that we're hearing more and more of these stories from, I mean, pretty popular figures, including, internet figures like Rhett and Link, but also theologians and pastors, and of course, congregants as well. So it's been a big thing that's been happening for a while now. But I've noticed something. Last month. It seems like all I'm reading on like some of these bigger websites are these blog posts just really going at deconstructionists, and it's basically saying, they're maybe not outright saying it, but they're inferring that the deconstructionists are at fault for a lot of the people leaving the evangelical church. And like, let's be honest, let's be clear. There is a huge departure that is happening right now over this pandemic has really hit the evangelical world hard when it comes to just numbers. And I think that there's a lot more reasons than just deconstruction being a part of that, although I would probably say that it has definitely affected that number. But there are lots of people who are leaving the evangelical church. And I think that a lot of that has fed into these blog posts of different organizations, whether it's Nine Marks, the Gospel Coalition, Desiring God, other websites like, is it Pathos or Pathos? I think it's Pathos. I don't think there's an E there. I don't remember my Greek. But that website, there's tons of these things, and they're really going at deconstruction. So I wanted to talk a little bit about deconstruction, and because I do know that there are some people on my channel who watch my videos somewhat regularly that are going through this, and they've had a hard time over the last few years. Even sometimes, I hear these stories about like decades of them not coming to church and not wanting to be involved in that world because of what they've experienced and some of the issues that they see. So I know that there are lots of people who watch my videos who are in this process of deconstruction or have gone through this process of deconstruction. And if that's you, I want to hear your story. I would love to know what you're thinking about, maybe some of the main reasons why you deconstructed or why you're going through deconstruction, or maybe you're watching this and you come from a different angle. You come from a more established angle within evangelicalism, and you don't like this term. I have run into this quite a bit, where people do not like the term deconstruction. I'm fine with it. I think that it's helpful. It's a helpful term, but there are, of course, some reasons why some of these guys don't like this term of deconstruction, and most of it comes down to where it comes from. Because people use it now, and they're just using it online, and maybe they heard it from Rhett and Link. Maybe they've seen people like Maxwell and Harris leave the faith and talk about their deconstruction stories, or they listen to popular podcasts that talk about deconstruction, or have read books on deconstruction, and they just kind of get their terminology from that. What the people who don't like this term usually talk about is where it comes from with Derrida. Jacques Derrida. I'm probably saying that name wrong. I never know how to pronounce things, guys. Don't come to my channel for pronunciation. You're not going to get any. But Derrida was a French philosopher. I think his main work was in like the 50s and 60s, who came up with this idea of deconstruction. And what he was trying to do was to kind of break down some of like the barriers between two different binaries. I think that's usually how it's put. So different binaries like left and right, or I'm probably a bad example, but gender, male and female. And so what he would try to do is to kind of like bounce between these two things and kind of take a little bit out of this, take a little bit out of that to kind of blur these lines. I think, I'm coming at it from, I'm not a philosophy major. I've had to study it in seminary and Bible college, but like I'm not a philosopher. So I don't understand all the nuances of it, to be fair. But what I understand is that it's another form of postmodernism. Just that truth is not objective; it's subjective, and so we can't be so firm on these different establishments, these different established principles within Western civilization. And so we can break them down a little bit over the edges. Next thing you know, these lines are then beginning to be blurred, and we can find out that there's no such thing as a binary. So the idea of deconstruction is to kind of deconstruct the differences between two different things, or at least perceived different things. So that's at least my understanding of where it comes from. And so if you think about that, that's a pretty dangerous ideology, right? Like if that's let loose on pretty much anything, and you kind of just roll with it and you say, yes, I totally affirm what Derrida was teaching and promoting, then when you come to issues, especially when it comes to like moral things, some applications of theology, you can have some problems. You can also have some problems, of course, when it comes to theology, things like the Trinity. You take that kind of thinking into it, and a lot can be undone in a short amount of time. Now, my main defense for using the term would then be no one really knows Derrida. I mean, like, except for maybe like fanboys and philosophers and academics. When we're talking about deconstruction, I don't think that anyone really. Maybe there's a few here and there of just normal people like you and me who think about Derrida and have read Derrida, and like that affects how they think about Christianity, and they take it to it and deconstruct it that way. Maybe they do. But I think that the vast majority of people who are going through this process or have gone through this process are not thinking about deconstruction from Derrida's perspective. They're thinking about it in the common vernacular. The example that I've used in talking about this is to talk about fundamentalism. 70 years ago, 80 years ago, time is flying, man. It would be 80 years ago now. When you talk about fundamentalism, it meant something completely different than it does now. That was when R.A. Torrey was getting the articles all together and talking, because there was like this pushback, not as much as fundamentalists would like to say, but there was a lot of pushback of German higher criticism and all this kind of stuff attacking what they thought of as the fundamentals of the faith. And so they wrote these articles, and if you affirm these articles, then you were a fundamentalist. That's not what it means today, right? If I look at you and say you're a fundamentalist, there's probably a lot that goes into it that doesn't have anything to do with R.A. Torrey, right? Like you might not even know who R.A. Torrey is. So that obviously that word has changed, and so many words change, right? Words that were cuss words, just like 20 years ago, they are not anymore, and we say them all the time. Dang, like that word has changed, or at least that acceptance of the word has changed. You can talk about all different kinds of things that were acceptable back in the 90s when I was growing up, words that we would call each other, and now you cannot call someone that. It wasn't a cuss word then, but words change based on who's using them and the way that they're using them, and of course the acceptance of that term or the disapproval of that term. And so, yes, now you can't say those words. So deconstruction, I think, is a word that at its, foundation, I guess, if you want to put it that way, when it was first used and first taught by Derrida, meant a certain thing. And I think in a lot of circles, or maybe not a lot, I would say in some circles, it would probably still mean that. But that's not how a lot of people are using that word. They're using it to talk about their doubts, to talk about what they've experienced when it comes to local churches and their experience in that local church and the abuse they may have suffered there. They're talking about that and trying to deconstruct that. So that's what I would say to someone who, like, maybe you're here and you're watching, or you're going to be watching, and you're thinking, like, you can't use this term. Christians should not use this term. That's fair. If you don't want to use that term, that's fine. But to look at others and say they can't use this term, I think you're taking a little too much into that historical perspective of what the word has meant, and not looking at current circumstances and looking at what people are meaning by that. But let's see. Tim Frisch, hopping in. The first Christians who ever deconstructed John 6:6:6. Is this a joke on sixes? You can't make that kind of joke, Tim. I don't know what John 6:66 is. Maybe I should go there. I don't know if it was a joke or not, but I'm gonna go there anyways. And you might be watching this, Tim, and be like, "Don't. It was just a little joke." But I'm gonna go there and just see, because maybe it is. Let's go here. Let's go to 66. Let's see here. From that moment, many of his disciples turned back and no longer accompanied him. Oh, okay. I see where you're coming from. All right. So there was teaching that Jesus had that they didn't like, and so that they deconstructed and stopped following him. I get you. I'm going to push back a little bit in a little while as we go through this thing. But I would say that for a lot of people, deconstruction does not always lead to that. Maybe it does. Maybe it does for some people. But I don't think that the stories that I've heard, and I've heard quite a few, as I've spent a lot of time on Twitter, and in the certain circles that I kind of roll in on Twitter, I see a lot of stories about deconstruction, and actually many of them have led them back to the church, maybe to more healthy churches and to different denominations for sure. Yeah, I understand what you're getting at, though. Not a 666 joke. Okay. Just making sure. You never know. I don't know. Sometimes jokes just go like completely over my head. I don't know, guys. Why do I have a show? I don't know. I don't know anything. Let's talk about what I do know. Let's talk about why people are upset about deconstruction, and really what I'm seeing here. I'm seeing lots of articles. If we go here, this is from Baptist News Global, and this is an opinion piece from David Gushee, who wrote a book on post-evangelicalism. I think that might actually be the name of the book, After Evangelicalism. To be clear, I don't agree with him. So don't lob me into this. But I'm just saying, like, this is one of the guys who is promoting deconstruction, and he seems to be pretty happy with the idea of life after evangelicalism. So for him, he's looking at deconstruction, and I think this is where a lot of guys are seeing this and these kinds of thoughts from people and are getting very defensive, and saying, okay, well, this must also, they would just assume that everybody else who's talking about deconstruction is meaning it this way of kind of burning it all down. And I mean, that's the name of his book, right? After Evangelicalism. So he is very much dedicated toward that idea of being, what's next after evangelicalism. Once we get rid of it, once we've deconstructed it, what can we do as Christians after this thing? But it's interesting. this has caused all kinds of issues because like there are a couple books maybe you're familiar with, maybe you're not, maybe you read a lot, maybe you don't. I read a lot. And so there are some books here, Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumez. I listened to that book. I had it on Audible. A lot of good points. I think that she was pretty fair, actually, about the history of it. And that's really what these books are focused on. Jesus and John Wayne, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. I have not read that one. There's also Amy Bird's book on something to the same effect. Very similar kind of book. The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. I'm not even going to get into that because I know how the internet works. And I know if Jamar Tisby is not someone that a lot of people are fans of when it comes to the circles that I run in. And to be honest, I haven't read his book, so I don't know. Taking America Back for God, Worldview Theory, Witness, and the Future of Evangelical Faith. These books were mentioned in this article. Just being mentioned in this article has led to a lot of people being upset and going at these authors. And actually, Jonathan Leeman, who I have a lot of his books, he writes a lot for 9 Marks, and so I've got all these little 9 Marks books and then a few of his other ones. Great books. I really have benefited quite a bit from Jonathan Leeman's ministry there with 9 Marks. But he went at David Gushee and specifically these authors who are mentioned in this article, and saying that they are all about deconstruction. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of people, when they're talking about deconstruction, actually get wrong. Because that these individuals are associated with this article because they're mentioned here. And I think that there was also something about how they had tweeted, thanking him for involving their books in it, that they are also deconstructionists. And now I can't speak for every one of them, but I can speak for those who have been on Twitter all day. Man, if you're bored after this, not now, but after this, go on to Twitter and look at Jonathan Leeman's Twitter and start looking through some of these threads going on today. It's pretty crazy. It's pretty lively. But basically, Jonathan Leeman looked at these individuals and started his own thing. He wrote an article, or I guess it's an editor's note. But I mean, look at this thing. This thing is huge. When I think of a note, like I just got to the bottom. I'm scrolling as fast as I can. When I think of a note, I think of like maybe a couple paragraphs, but this thing is huge. So it's an article. Maybe not the best written, most well written. Is that how English works? Article, but it's an article. And in here, he actually goes at Gushee and also this idea of these books being mentioned in that article. And he just basically calls them deconstructionists because they're mentioned in the article. And they were not happy about this, or at least the few that I saw interact with him on Twitter, they were not happy and started going at him. Because what they were trying to do, or at least this, I haven't read all of the books, so I don't know for certain. But what they're claiming, and I'm just going to take their word for it, they're claiming that they were just talking about the history of evangelicalism. And then it's kind of like, do with that history what you will, kind of a thing. And as far as Jesus and John Wayne goes, I think that would be mostly true. I do think that, our biases leak into everything we do. My biases leak into this show, right? Like, it's going to come from a Reformed Baptist perspective. And also, to be honest, someone who has been somewhat hurt by the church and different experiences that I've had, I understand that my biases come through in that. So Jesus and John Wayne, I would say probably there are some of the biases that leak into the book. But overall, I would say that the book did a decent job in giving the history of evangelicalism. And in nowhere in that book does she call herself a deconstructionist or affirm the idea of being a deconstructionist. But that's the problem with a lot of these individuals now who are really going at deconstructionists. And I titled this video, "Are Deconstructionists Breaking the Church?" Why? Because I'm asking that question, but there are so many in the evangelical world, and specifically those in powerful positions who are in charge of some of like these, if you want to use the term, big Eva organizations, who seem to be very concerned. And more than just like, this is something, we don't want anyone to leave the faith. Let me say that right off the bat as we get through this thing. I don't want anyone to leave the faith. If you are a Christian and you're starting to go through this process of deconstruction, or you're using this term, I don't want you to abandon the faith. I don't want you to be like John 6:66 and leave Jesus. That's not the right way to go. I do think it leads to obviously spiritual damnation, but also, just a lot of hurt and pain and isolation. I don't think that it would be helpful for you. So I don't want you to go down that road. So I feel like I have to say that. Like, I'm not saying that this is the right way to go necessarily, but I will say that it doesn't always go that way. And a lot of these guys are looking at it, and I think they're a little scared, to be honest. I think they're scared about organizations and big organizations failing. And they're blaming a lot of it on deconstructionists, and they're asking that question, are deconstructionists breaking the church? Because they're writing article after article. And I mean, even if you look at this article, I would encourage you. I don't have them in the description right now, but if you're watching on the replay, or you want to come back to it, maybe about like 15 minutes after I'm done streaming, I'll put these articles into the description here. But you could also just Google it and go into 9 Marks. If you go 9 Marks Deconstruction, I think it'll be the first one that pops up. But there are lots of things that Jonathan Leeman just says in this article that are concerning. He says that these individuals, who again were just like described in the other article from Gushy. So let me paint a clear picture here. You have what's his name? His first name. You have David Gushy over here. And I think that he would fall under all the categories that you would typically describe deconstructionists as. I think that is fair to say. You write a book after evangelicalism that you're kind of wanting the whole thing to burn down. Like, I mean, maybe it's not like a happy thing, but you're thinking that there can be good that comes from it. So I would say that he would fit into this category that a lot of these other guys are scared about, as like a classic deconstructionist, if you want to put it that way. So there's Gushy, and Gushy writes an article that just mentions these other books and says that they were helpful in understanding the history of evangelicalism, and then he goes on from there. Then you have Jonathan Leeman, who, conservative, evangelical, one of the main guys there at 9 Marks, writes this article and attacks. And he does. He attacks because they're associated with Gushy. And I think that there probably is problematic stuff in their teachings, but he's not going at them for that. He's just saying he's lumping them in with Gushy because Gushy wrote about them. So it's concerning when those kind of tactics are being used. But I mean, like Leeman, again, I have greatly benefited from a lot of his stuff. But one thing that Lehman does is he actually says that these some kind of a phrasing. It's buried somewhere. I should have maybe marked it up so that I could just go to it. But in this article, there's some kind of phrasing like you can only walk with the devil for too long. Basically saying like, hey, this is a slippery slope. If you're going to, look at history this way and, keep on rolling in these crowds kind of a thing, that eventually you're going to give in. That's not how you talk to Christians. Like, if someone's professing to be a Christian, the way that we do this thing called fellowship is that if you can affirm the Apostles' Creed, if you can affirm Orthodox Christianity, that we take your word for it until you prove us otherwise, right? Like that's the way that Christians are supposed to interact with one another. So I have to take Kristen Kobles-Dumez at her word and say that she's affirming orthodoxy, and I'm going to take her word for it. And I think that Jonathan Lehman would as well, but he's also saying that you're walking with Satan. Like, that's not a helpful thing to say to a Christian, and it's not theologically accurate. Like, Christians don't walk with Satan. We walk with Jesus. That's the main thing. And if you're walking with Satan, I think that pretty well affirms like the idea that they would be considered unchristian, right? Like that they would be on the outside of the camp. So I don't think that it's a helpful thing to just be throwing around words like that. And so he's written this article about that. And like I've said, if you like the tea, if you like watching like the tea get spilled right in front of you, then go onto Twitter, look at Jonathan Lehman's Twitter, and look at the interactions there. They're getting into it. They've been doing it at least until I started getting things together here. They've been doing it basically all day. But there's a lot more. I talked about Patheos. And there's this article, and I think this also describes some things. I'm basically just talking about deconstruction as a main idea. If you have thoughts, don't be scared. You can disagree with me. That's fine. I want to hear your perspective. Hop into the chat and let me know. But we're basically just talking about some of the main ideas of deconstruction. Kind of a lighter episode today. Dark topic maybe, but not going too heavy-handed into things. But there's this article here, Why an Entire Generation of Youth Are Finding Evangelical Churches Inadequate. And in here, they talk not necessarily about deconstruction, but I think really what a lot of people are saying is the main thing behind deconstruction, and that is, how to put it for YouTube's sake, sexual ethics. That a lot of people are saying, well, if you're deconstructing because of this. You just want to do what you want to do. And that's not true. That's not true in the cases that I've found. I'm sure that there are definitely cases like that. Like as someone, I've been in ministry. Like I know how people act, and I know that usually when they say certain things to you, there are other things that are going on. I understand that. But when I've talked to people who have gone through this process, they usually are not. It's not because they're confused about their sexuality. They're not confused on gender. They're not confused on political things, such as who can marry who and all that kind of stuff. Usually it's because of beliefs, theological beliefs, and that they're having a hard time wrestling with some aspect of theology. And then they're looking at the church and seeing Christians acting in ways that they ought not to, and basically what 2 Peter 2 says, and they deny Jesus their master. and then they're deconstructing from that viewpoint. But I mean, it is true. I think the polling would be right. But this is why a lot of people, when they look at polls like this and articles like this, they're taking it and going, okay, well, if that's true, then those people who are deconstructing or using this term, they're also in this camp. They're the ones who are going through this, and that's not always the case. We could be talking about two different camps altogether. Now, I do think that there's definitely some overshadowing. If you're talking about like a Venn diagram, that there's some coming together there on these issues. But I think that for the most part, when people are deconstructing, it's not just because of these kinds of political issues, sexual ethic related issues, that they're actually having some kind of crisis of their faith, and specifically talking about their theology, or maybe like I said, the involvement that they had at a certain local church and what happened there, their experience there. MJ hopping in saying hi, how's it going, man? Hope your wife is feeling better after the booster. Yeah. So we're just talking about deconstruction and just having a light go of it until this one. Got to be honest. This one, if we go over here, 4 causes of deconstruction. This one had me going, guys. Got to be honest. When I read this, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Because, all right, let's cards on the table. If you are in this chat, have you deconstructed your faith? That's my question to you. Have you? I would say that I have. I would not have used the terminology of deconstructing. I would probably have talked about it as doubt. But I grew up in a very conservative family, where it was very clear that faith was not genuine. I need to be a little bit careful about what I say, but that faith was not genuine, that it was a ruling tactic, tactic of authoritarianism and control. So that's my background. Now, I was also, I was saved at the age of 10, and I started pursuing pastoral ministry at 12 years old. If you didn't watch the last episode, the beginning part talking about our backgrounds, you can go to there for more about that ridiculousness. But that was me. But also when I think it was 16, my cousin, he committed suicide, and that kind of wrecked me. I wasn't close with my cousin, but from the outset, he was a godly guy. They talked about Christian faith a lot, and he was a police officer, and seemed to have like so much going for him, and wife, young kids. It was pretty devastating. He lived farther away, so like I said, I wasn't super close with him. But that got my mind thinking, like, how can a Christian do that? And so then I started going down this rabbit hole. And at the time, I don't know anything about Derrida. Like I'm just doubting my faith. But I started looking at things and being like, okay, well, if that can happen, how does that affect this? And how does that affect this idea and this idea? And basically what it came down to was the existence of pain and suffering in the world. And I would say that usually it comes down to that. But when people are deconstructing, I think that usually that is at play. Basically, how can God be good while there's suffering and evil in the world? And that's not always an emotional thing. For me it was. I had some emotions attached to it, different experiences going on. But that's not always the case. It could be just rationalizing and thinking about these things. So it's not always because of someone's experience. It could also be their beliefs. But I would say that I was deconstructing. And the most helpful thing, I don't have it down here, it's upstairs on a bookshelf, was The Problem of Pain with C.S. Lewis. There's C.S. Lewis just peeking through back there. But I read that book at 16 years old, and that really helped me wrestle through a few things. And I started to be able to discern, okay, what is genuine faith and what is not when it came to my circumstances, and started evaluating, all right, well, if I can cling to this truth in the Bible, that can help me get through this thing that I see in the world. So that's my story. Now, if you like, I don't generally call it deconstruction. I wouldn't, like, if you were just to ask me, have you deconstructed your faith? I would probably say no. But that's my kind of deconstruction story, if you will. So what I'm getting at is to say, I understand that I'm a little closer to this, and maybe you've never doubted your faith. MJ's hopping in here and saying, yep, is that about your wife feeling better? Or is that about deconstructing your faith? But I think a lot of people have. But I understand that it's a personal thing to me, and maybe you don't fit into that and you've never deconstructed your faith. I think that we need to be charitable toward each other, and articles like this, not necessarily charitable. Let's look at this thing. Deconstruction is a symptom, not the root cause. A proper diagnosis is important because, to continue the medical analogy, each underlying condition has a different cure. Let's see, he says both. Mine happened through a pretty controversial figure, Rob Bell, in his book, Velvet Elvis. Yeah, I've known a bunch of guys who, that book was a big one for a lot of guys, and girls, all right, just people. But yeah, Rob Bell as a figure has been really crucial for a lot of people's deconstruction stories. So, yeah, someday I'll do an episode about Rob Bell and my real thoughts on him. But, yeah, here's something I will say right off the bat. I'm finding it interesting. All right. Here's let me get my tinfoil hat on and talk about conspiracy. I think that there's something going on here. Like I said, in the last couple weeks, all these big organizations have started talking about deconstruction when they did not want to talk about it. I mean, they were trying to minimize it at all costs. You know, some of them wrote articles about Rhett and Link when, they were, because you're going to get clicks, right? You put Rhett and Link deconstruction, and those people are really popular, so it's going to get clicks. So I think a lot of people wrote articles then, but since, I mean, it's been a huge thing, especially over the pandemic, and not a lot written on it until the last month or so, and it's just been article after article, and I'm finding it interesting because deconstruction, I think, is when you take your faith, you put it on the table, and you kind of take it apart a little bit, and you ask yourself, is this true? Now, there are different measurements that you have for that truth. Some people will say just philosophy and rationalization. Is it true logically? And I think that's not exactly the right. I think those things definitely play into it. But for me, I look at it and say, is this biblically true? Is the Bible true? That's the first question you got to answer. And then if you say yes, then you look at it through that lens and say, does the Bible say that this is true? And you start taking apart your faith and looking at it, examining it. And to me, that's what I think a lot of people use the term deconstruction for. So buried in that is the idea of taking apart. Like, there is imagery in this idea of deconstruction in just the term. There's imagery of taking things apart, deconstructing it. And I find it interesting, and this is just me. I could be totally out to lunch, and maybe you're watching this and you're just being like, you've been out to lunch this whole time. That's fine. This isn't going to be the topic that I always discuss. But I just find it interesting that all these articles are now talking about deconstruction as a medicinal kind of thing, like a medical thing, like that it's like about a disease and you need medicine. This is something that's like, it's not just here. Like in all of these articles that I'm reading from like 9 Marks and Gospel Coalition and Desiring God and all these different big Eva, if you want to use that term, organizations, they're talking about it in this way. And I just find it really interesting. I think that there's purpose behind that. I don't know if it was an effort that they all got together and say we need to talk about this thing and talking about it with these terms, but I don't know why they're switching it. But they all are. Like it's just bizarre to me. I'm just pointing that out before we get too far into this article. And I want to break this article down. Cameron hopping in here. I never doubted the faith, but I realized last year that my beliefs about it didn't make sense. And so I'm still figuring out what is true. I appreciate you being honest. Yeah, it's a thing that a lot of people are going through, and they're wondering, why do I believe this? That's a big thing. It's not just like, okay, these beliefs are true or not, but why am I believing in it? And a lot of that plays into the culture that we were raised in. And this, I think, is actually what Jesus and John Wayne gets really right, is the culture that a lot of evangelicals were brought up in has kind of fed into this. And why do you believe that? So I hope that you come to a good sound landing point on that, Cameron, but you're not alone. A lot of people are going through this, and a lot of people are questioning the beliefs that they've been raised to have. Maybe you grew up in the church. I'm going to assume that might be the case because a lot of people have that background. I certainly had that background, and you're left wondering, why am I believing this? Is this something that I've been kind of forced into? Do I actually believe it? But you're not alone. But yeah, so this article here, just a little interesting note that they're really switching the metaphor here. But let's look at this just kind of quickly. I've walked as a pastor with many wrestling with deconstruction. While not exhaustive, these are the 4 most common root causes I've seen. Let's look at the gospel's treatment plan for each. So this is what I was talking about, like the idea that deconstruction is the disease and the gospel is the cure. This is something that I'm seeing over and over and over again when it comes to these kinds of articles. Just interesting. So his first one, let's be clear, he is a pastor. And as a pastor, you deal with a lot of people who are going through the idea of deconstruction or doubting their faith, whatever kind of terminology they want to use, what they're comfortable with, what you're comfortable with, these kinds of ideas. So this is not necessarily someone who's just like in some ivory tower and looking down on the peasants and being like, oh, the issue of deconstruction. Let me give you my profound wisdom on this. This is not that. This is a pastor who's saying, this is what I've seen. Doesn't necessarily make him right, but church hurt. Many who deconstruct have been wounded by abusive or manipulative church leaders or generally unhealthy church cultures. And then he references people like Ravi Zacharias, Carl Lentz, and Mark Driscoll, the easy targets. But there's so many more. It's not just those guys. This is one of the things, like, oh, you mean like the pastors who went to jail for what they did or had huge podcasts made about how awful they were to their congregants and church staff. It's not just that. It's not just those people. To which I would also say, I could be wrong, but didn't Gospel Coalition do events with this guy? And well, of course, this one. Everybody knows that. Just saying. The portrayal can make the whole thing look like a sham. The pain can be excruciating and disorienting. Of course. It's easier to throw the baby out with the bathwater than when you feel like you've been drowning. Church hurt is real, but deconstruction is a false cure. Now, here's where I think he gets this right. Church hurt is awful. If you've been through that, as most, I think, have, when they start deconstructing their faith, it's really easy to just accept the world as it is when things are going well for you, right? Like if if your parents were great parents and your church is a really good church and your life experience has been like pretty minimally like free of pain, then most likely you're probably not going to start questioning things, right? Why would you? Like everything around you seems to be going so well. So I think he is right in saying that, church hurt is a major aspect of this. But I find it interesting what he's about to say. You don't need to ignore the church's problems to protect its reputation. This is very concerning for me, because this is what I see so often. It's like, all right, well, don't talk bad about the church. You can't talk bad about the church. You're hurting the reputation. I have, when I was going through some things at our most recent church, I went to Twitter and made a couple jokes about business meetings going awry. I thought it was funny. And got some likes on it. Some other people could relate. But I had people reaching out to me and being like, hey, you can't talk about your church that way. You just go on Twitter and trash them. It's like, well, first, I didn't say what church it was. I didn't say even if it was my church. But those kinds of people are out there. I don't feel any responsibility as a Christian to defend the church. That's not my job. My job is not to defend the church. My job is to follow Jesus, to be kind and gentle, of course. But when things are going on, you got to say what's going on. And just right off the bat, coming in harsh on these things of saying that you need to, basically protect its reputation. Show me the scripture passage that says that a Christian needs to protect the reputation of the church. No. I think that Jesus does a good enough job of that, talking about the true church. There are churches out there that are false, that misrepresent Jesus. And those churches should get called out, and those leaders should be called out. And it's not the business of any church member to protect the reputation of the church. And actually, I would say this kind of thinking is why a lot of churches, for the sake of protecting the reputation of the church, they don't say things to the authorities about what happens behind closed doors at their churches. Now, I know that this pastor would be saying, like, of course not. You wouldn't do that. But this is the kind of thinking that leads to that. It is not the Christian's duty to protect the church. That's Jesus' job. Now, you don't need to go accusing the church of everything. That's also Satan's job. So don't walk with Satan, like Jonathan Leeman says. That's, you don't want to just go around accusing the church of everything. But there's a difference between accusing and saying what happened. Accusing would also mean that there would be lies involved. And when you're saying the truth, there's a big difference. Let's see. I see a few more comments hopping in on the chat. Cameron, yeah, I grew up in a church and definitely started out with the beliefs of my parents. I didn't even know there were significant differences in beliefs between churches until I started questioning. Yeah. A lot of people are right there with you, including myself. MJ, talking smack about the meeting you just got out of is one of the most universal pastimes there is. Yeah, man. How else are you supposed to deal with these things sometimes? Sometimes you just got to, try to laugh it off and make a joke. That's why we do it at funerals, right? Like, we make jokes at funerals. We try to laugh at funerals, because otherwise, how do you get through these things? All right. So he says basically that church hurt is the first problem. The solution to bad community isn't abandoning community. I think that there's a really good point to be made in that. But sometimes you do need to get out. I would also say that sometimes you need to be out for a time. And I don't think a lot of pastors recognize that and are okay with that. But sometimes you need to take a break. And especially like if you're coming out of like really abusive situations in the church world, you might need to stay out for a little bit just so you can get healthy before diving deep into something that could be problematic. You don't know. That's the thing. You don't know if you're going to find another church, whether they're going to be the exact same way. That's just the fact of the matter. But I do think that he's right in saying that church hurt plays into it. But he says that's one reason. 2 is poor teaching. Some Christians have been led to believe they must choose between faith and science. Take out science, insert evolution, because that's what he means. Because of poor teaching on Genesis 1. Others have been led to believe God is a vindictive sadist from a popular caricature of hell. Best abandon Christian faith entirely on account of some dubious or sloppy teaching, right? I mean, like, yeah, this happens, that you get some really bad teaching. Honestly, I don't know why more fundamentalists don't deconstruct their faith, because a lot of the teaching is akin to this. Not a lot of great teaching happening in fundamentalist circles, just going to be honest. I've been around a lot, and that's usually the case. But that doesn't always happen. I do think that he says something really good here. Jesus is the best model of replacing bad teaching with good teaching. This is what I always say when it comes to issues of deconstruction. Regardless of where you're coming from, whether it's church hurt that has been a part of your story, whether you just have sincere doubts about certain aspects of theology, whether you're wrestling with evolution and how does that play into Christianity? Can these things mix? Should they not mix? Those kinds of questions, regardless of any of those. The way that I would always, anyone who's going through deconstruction, the way that I would point you to what I think would be a good direction is look at Jesus. The reason why I'm a Christian is because of Jesus. It's not because of how churches act and behave. It's not because of, interesting theological concepts. The reason why I'm a Christian is because of Jesus Christ. How compelling he is. How real he is. You will never find a more honest and sincere person than Jesus. You will never find a more authoritative teacher than Jesus. No more compassion, all these things. You can say a million different things. As John says, you could, write forever about it. And like the world could not contain all the stories of the goodness of Jesus. That's why I'm a Christian. And if you're deconstructing your faith and having sincere doubts, I would say look to Jesus. And let Jesus be your filter. Let Jesus be the lens through which you see everything else. Jesus believes in the Old Testament. That's why I believe in the Old Testament. Jesus believes all these different things. You can look through the entirety of Scripture. You can look at inerrancy. Jesus is an inerrantist. He believes in inerrancy. That's why I believe in inerrancy. If Jesus does, I do. That's kind of how I roll. I think that he is exactly the person to look to if you're deconstructing your faith. That he is the example of what it looks like to live a good, kind, compassionate life, a life impacted by, the Christian ethic. Jesus lived it out. He showed us how to live. He paid the price for our sins, all these different wonderful things. But I think that he is the example to look at. Okay, that's not a new comment. All right, let's keep on going here. So he talks about that. He talks about a desire to sin, and this is the one that I talked about earlier. Some deconstruct out of a desire to justify their sin. Many friends in ministry have suddenly had big questions about God, then proceeded to quickly deconstruct their faith. I do find that a little interesting, and I think in some cases that can be true, especially when it comes to people in authoritative positions. It's interesting that that Venn diagram would be pretty big, like the overlap would be huge. Of people saying like, "Oh, I'm beginning to question some things," and the next thing you know, they're divorcing their wife, or going through something. So I think that there's some accuracy to that, but that doesn't always happen, and I think it's a main problem that people just say, oh, this is the main reason. He doesn't necessarily say that. If the problem is a desire to sin, the solution is confession and repentance. Jesus invites all to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. I would agree with that. Here again, he does this. Deconstruction is poison, not medicine, just over and over again. It supplements the sin that's killing you rather than healing it. It allows you to save face, to look virtuous in your departure from God while distracting you from squarely facing your true motivations. That's not true. It allows you to save face, to look virtuous in your departure from God. It's interesting that a lot of these guys are going like, oh, you're just deconstructing for the optics. Like that you're just concerned about optics. Here's the thing. If you're going through this process, you're hurting. It's painful. You know why it's painful? Because it wrecks your relationships. There was a thing going around on Twitter of reasons why you deconstructed your faith, wrong answers only. And my addition to that was because I want all of my friends and family to disown me. And like obviously being sarcastic with it. But that could happen. And that does happen. If you deconstruct your faith, that's not like a pleasant experience. It's not something that people want to do. I don't understand why some of these writers and theologians and pastors don't get that through their heads. Like it's not something that's enjoyable. It's a painful experience. It hurts and it ruins relationships. And people that said that they loved you unconditionally will leave you. It happens all the time. I see it all the time. People saying like, my parents won't talk to me. You think that's what people want? You think that's to them looking virtuous and, trying to, save on optics and things like that? No. I just don't buy it. And then street cred. Doubt is hip. The desire to fit in with the cultural ethos of our moment is strong. That's why so many deconversion stories sound like everyone's reading off the same script. It's well-worn cliches signaling conformity to accepted norms. Celebrities are leading the charge. There's influence to be had, platforms to be built, and money to be made. It gets Rob Bell on Oprah. That was a while ago. Bolsters Glennon Doyle's book sales and lets Rhett and Link host Nacho Libre and Harry Potter on their popular YouTube channel. Somebody doesn't know YouTube. That's been happening for a while. A wave of exvangelical podcasters and TikTok stars are following in the wake, with a whole cottage industry to welcome and cheer them on. There's clout in distancing oneself from outdated views of sex and gender, an obscure Bible with talking snakes and forbidden shellfish, and offensive doctrines like wrath and hell, and he goes on. This is the point where I just go, no. This is just not accurate. It's not accurate to describe people leaving their faith for this reason. Now, are there some? Of course, there are always going to be some that do things for whatever reason you think of. You could think of the most obscure reason and you say, this is why people do it. And there will be people who do it for that exact reason. That's just the way the world is. But the vast majority of people that I see are not doing it for these reasons, these superficial reasons. I do think that that he has points, desire to sin, poor teaching, and church hurt. I think that those are valid reasons that I think people have, but I think this one actually shows his cards. That doubt is hip, and people are just doing it to be popular. Like I said, it is a super painful experience. I haven't had to go through it. I've done aspects of it. This last episode that we did last week, talking about fundamentalism, there were aspects of it that, I did deconstruct a few things, if you want to put it that way. I wouldn't necessarily describe it that way, but I can see the similarities between deconstruction and what Heather and I went through talking about our stories. But it's painful. Even just something like that, changing denominations, is painful. The people that you thought had your back and were your friends, not necessarily accurate. As soon as you start shifting on some things that they don't want you to shift on. And that's just one thing. If you start leaving your faith, if I left the faith, I just think about who would be my friend. Like, maybe MJ. I don't know. But like, there wouldn't be a huge line there. That's what these people have to look forward to, is pain and, like uncertainty, right? Like, it's your faith. It's what you've grounded your whole life in, and like what you've looked at the world through, your whole lens of everything. And you're going to leave that. I don't think that people do that for reasons like being hip and so that they can have Nacho Libre and Harry Potter on their channel. I don't think that that's the reason why Christians do that, or at least people who are professing to be Christians. And MJ, heck yeah, we would be friends either way. I appreciate it, man. But I'm just saying, like, I don't think that Christians go that way. Now, I know I've kind of been just like rambling on this stream today. And like, I thought about like having like this really robust, outline. Usually is what I do when I do one of these live streams. But I just kind of wanted to talk from my heart today and say, I just think that Christians, pastors, theologians, get past the word. Here's some what I'll say. If you don't like the word deconstruction, find a better one. You do it. And say this is what you need to use. You do the work if you're really concerned about that. But I would also say, like, look past it. Look at the hurting people. Look at the people who are losing their faith. And, as a Calvinist, like I understand my soteriology, but understand that from our perspective, that's really all we can deal with. And whether someone professes their faith or not, I'm not talking about God's perspective. I'm talking about our perspective. What it looks like for someone to abandon the faith is to first have questions. And if those questions are being like, oh, you shouldn't deconstruct, you're just doing it to be cool or to fit in, or because you want to sin, or because you're too emotional about, whatever hurt you experienced, or because your pastor was a bad pastor. That's essentially the reasons that he gave. And when we kind of like hurl those at people who have honest questions, that's not helpful. It's not helpful. It's not loving. It's not kind. Like, maybe we can look past the word deconstruction or exvangelical, and we can look past those terms and see someone who has honest questions. And I would say that the vast majority of people who are going through this painful process have honest questions. And maybe if we look past those terms and look past or stop judging why they're going through that or why they're really doing it, and maybe just answered some of those questions or tried to answer them, or just showed loving compassion toward them and walked through this with them, maybe we'd actually be able to help. And maybe there wouldn't be a deconstruction problem that, supposedly all these organizations are seeing it as like the biggest thing in the world. I do think it's a big deal, but Jesus says, I'm going to build his church. I'm going to build my church. So I'll leave the building to him and the reputation to him, and he can do that. And we'll just try to be faithful in the meanwhile. Last one before we end things here, just quickly. I'm just going to point at this. Now, if you've been on my channel for a while, you know that Bethlehem Baptist has been going through a lot of different things this last year. different things with their president of the school there, different things with professors there and elders on staff at Bethlehem. And I just find it so interesting that this is the article that they came out with. Like I said, over the last month, there's been just so many articles about deconstruction. And then this last week, it's been just like everyone's pushing it. And it's just interesting to me that all these guys are talking about it at the same time. But it is interesting that this is the approach that David Mathis, who is very plugged in to that world there at Bethlehem and a product of Bethlehem, and of course, one of the big shots at Desiring God, that this is the approach that he takes. And I think that shows a little bit of the attitude that this side of evangelicalism would have. Do you insult your Savior's bride? Let's just read like the first paragraph and then I'll be done. The church this, the church that. One way professing Christians betray a small, thin, and weak vision of the risen Christ is by dumping on the church. They might speak flippantly of what the church doesn't get or what the church does wrong or the problem with the church in our day. They claim to know better than the church. If only they could fix the church. Having become concerned with an oversight, error, or danger they see in some Christians or churches, they become careless with their words about the church, and particularly so when we consider what Christ himself says about her. The things I could say. This shows the abusive culture at Bethlehem. I really do. I don't think you need to like dive deep on people's personal stories. You could just look at this article and say, wait, you can't question things? Like, because that's what he's saying. Like, I do agree that there are people who are just like, the church is awful. The church, just burn it all down. Joker in the Dark Knight. Some men just want to watch the world burn. I get that there are some people like that. But look at like these attacks on the church are things like the church doesn't get this or the church does wrong here. What? We can't say that the church is wrong on something? And it's interesting that, Bethlehem fits into this quite a bit, of different things that have been going on there. I'm not going to get into all, the gossip of different things. You can go onto Twitter for things like that. But they've been accused of all kinds of things. And I think it's just very interesting that this is the kind of style that they come out with, talking about their version of deconstruction and really attacking people who would say that the church is wrong about something. Just very interesting to me. I probably made people upset in this. If you're upset, I'm sorry. But I wanted to talk about this because I think it's something that we as Christians need to be compassionate toward. I just do. I think that we need to have a little bit more kindness and generosity. Let's think better of people than just accusing them of different things and saying this is why you're doing it. When maybe we just need to listen to people and actually have honest conversations and not accuse them of walking with Satan and accuse them of trying to burn the whole thing down or that they're just wanting to have sex with this person or that person. These are the accusations that the vast majority of evangelicalism is lobbing at people who are having honest doubts. Now, again, there are, of course, people that aren't having honest doubts and they're just, maybe they do fit into one of these categories that they've talked about. But I think that we need to at least have conversations with them before we start saying, oh, this is why you're doing this. That's not how we deal with people. MJ hopping in here. Let's see. I think the church, why is that showing up this way? Okay. I think the church displays an astounding lack of self-awareness when it comes to deconstruction. Most churches aren't saying what is pushing people away from us, right? Instead, they say, here's why you're walking away and you're wrong. There's little good faith questioning happening in the church at large. Yeah. Well, when you have this kind of rhetoric being said, you can't question it. Because if you question it, then you're just insulting the Savior's bride. Well, maybe Jesus would also look at this and say, hey, you've gone wrong here. Like, how about I don't think we need to hear about David Mathis on this topic. Let's hear about it from Jesus. Like, let's see what Jesus actually teaches, and whether it accords with how the church is acting on A, B, and C. And maybe these people would be surprised to find that maybe they're not on the right about everything. Shocking. We could be wrong on things. Interesting. All right. I've rambled for long enough. And like I said, I'm sure that... Let's see my subscriber count. Let's see. Let's see if it's been affected. Let's go over here. Oh, hey, look at that. We have the same amount of subscribers. Interesting. We'll see if that keeps from this. I'm sure that there are people who disagree. If you disagree, that's fine, as long as you're kind and compassionate about it, and not assuming people's intentions. I always go to Philippians, and where Paul talks about think not only of your own interests, but the interests of others. It's not only just about stuff. It's also that we're supposed to think better about people. That we're supposed to assume that they have the best intentions until we're proven wrong. We are a trusting people, and I think that we've lost that in recent years. That we've lost that ability to just trust people and be kind and compassionate to them. That we're always, looking to critique and to judge, rather than trusting them. And then, if they prove us wrong on things, then there's something to be said there. Anyways, if you are still watching with me and haven't liked the video, you're not my friend anymore. Just saying, even if it's MJ. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. I'll be back at the end of the week, probably with another video of some kind, maybe apologizing for everything that I've said here. No, just kidding. Oh, yeah, that's why I wanted to show it. 18 away here. From 500, and when I hit 500, I'll do that live stream talking about how I do this stuff. And I don't know if you're interested in podcasting or starting a YouTube channel or video production. I'm definitely not an expert. That's not what I'm saying. But I think I've figured out some clever ways to do things on the cheap, and to make things look okay without having to spend a fortune. And so I'll talk about all that on a special live stream once we get to 500. So if you haven't subscribed, go subscribe. And if you're subscribed and you're questioning your subscription because of things I've said today, don't unsubscribe. I'm a little concerned about it. All right. That's it. I'll see you in the next one. Probably on Thursday.